So what happened was my mother and her two sisters were on the railroad train to Auschwitz to die. When you go to Auschwitz, there's a gas chamber, and
it's a death camp.
It's a death camp. So they were on the road. They were on the railroad train to Auschwitz, and the war ended, and the American soldiers stopped the train.
Before we dive in, it's important to remember that the information we provide is for informational purposes only. Every situation is unique, and decisions regarding your health or legal matters should be made after consulting with your own doctor or lawyer. Our aim is to inform and empower, but personal circumstances require personalized advice. Hi, welcome to another episode of Justice in Scrubs. I am attorney Richard Hastings, and I'm joined by my co-host,
Dr. Jeff Michaelis.
And today we have a very, very, very special guest. And our guest is Dr. Jeffrey Michaelis.
Thank you.
And normally we talk about topics involving medicine, because you're a doctor. But today we're going to talk about something very, very personal and something very sacred. And that is that your mother was a Holocaust survivor.
That's correct.
So why don't we go back to the beginning of where you grew up and what your childhood was like?
Okay, I grew up
I should stop. Excuse me, just one second. Fun fact, most people don't know, Jeff grew up in Jamaica.
Yes. Now, Jamaica, Queens, not Jamaica, the Caribbean. I wish I grew up in the Jamaica Caribbean, but actually Jamaica was a wonderful place to grow up. It was, there's really three parts of Jamaica. There's the normal, regular Jamaica, which was a working class community. That's where I grew up. There was Jamaica Estates, where there was a very wealthy part of Jamaica. And then there was the South Jamaica, which was more of a, as my kids would call it, a ghetto. There was a lot of projects. So we grew up in the normal, regular Jamaica. And it's pretty much a white community, but it was not all Jewish.
So tell us about your first experience that you recall about finding out that your mother was a Holocaust survivor.
You know, my mother really didn't talk about it. There was some certain things that we did in our house that was different than other people, but my mother never wanted to talk about it. My mother was always positive. She never wanted to look at the past. She was always looking at the future. My mother had two sisters. One sister was just like her. She was fearless, and every day was important, and always positive. And the third sister never got over the Holocaust. And whenever we visited her, all she would do was talk about it. And I guess I got most of my information from her, not from my mother. So I don't really, there's no one thing I can remember that we really talked about.
So where did your mother grow up?
My mother grew up in Dusseldorf. She grew up in a very fancy part of Dusseldorf. Her father was an engineer, and he owned a manufacturing company, and they were very well off. They had maids, they had a staff that. I remember she told me that during dinner, when they were finished, they would ring a bell, and the maids would come and clear off the table. So they were very wealthy.
And then what happened to your mother's family once the Nazis came to power?
So Kristallnacht was the beginning of the end. Kristallnacht was when the German soldiers came in and they broke all the lights. And so basically they turned the whole town. Where my mother lived, there was predominantly a Jewish neighborhood. And they basically turned the lights off. And they came in and they arrested mainly the men. So my grandfather was arrested and taken to the police station. Now, before Kristallnacht, there was talk about bad things were happening. So my grandmother went to the bank and took out a lot of money, maybe all the money. And she put it in suitcases. And my grandmother was fearless. I never met her, but she was tough as nails, just like my mother. And she went down to the police station and demanded that they release my grandfather. And she said to them, "I'm not leaving here without my husband. You can shoot me if you want to, but I'm not leaving." And then she gave him a lot of money. So they released him, and they said that he had to leave Germany in the next 24 hours. So my grandmother went to another suitcase and somehow in 24 hours got him on a boat that went to Cuba. Soon after that, my grandmother took the whole family and got another boat to bring them to Cuba to reunite with their father. Unfortunately, the boat that they were on went to Cuba, and actually they saw, my mother says she saw her father on the port, and then the boat was turned around. Roosevelt turned the boat around and didn't allow that boat to land. And then they went back, and they actually went to Holland. And that boat is called the Voyage of the Dam. And there's movies about it. And they were interned into a work camp in Holland. I don't know the name of it. My mother would not tell us the name. But it wasn't a concentration camp per se because it didn't have any gas chambers. And they didn't get numbers on their arms. But it was a work camp. And my mother's job was to sew the German soldiers' uniforms.
So when you think about, the resilience of people, to be a young mother, to take her 3 daughters, and to book a trip from Germany to Cuba, and then when you think about what that must have been like to be on that ship for days, if not weeks. And I'm sure the conditions were not really sanitary, and they didn't have great bathrooms and the food and all of the challenges that go with that. And then to think that this ship that has probably enough supplies to go to Cuba and drop everybody off and then get resupplied gets turned around with the same supplies that are now on the ship to go back to Europe.
Absolutely, right.
And then to go back to Europe and then find out you are going to an internment camp.
Right. My mother told me she slept on 2 chairs for 2 years.
And how long was she in this camp?
2 years.
And what happened to her mom and then to her sisters?
They all got tuberculosis, and my grandmother died from tuberculosis. And the 3 sisters survived.
And how old are the sisters at this particular point in time?
Well, they've all passed away.
No, but I mean back when their mom died.
Okay, my mother was born in 1927, and she was the youngest. And so this is 42. So she was like 15. They were 15, 17, 18.
So their mom dies, and I can't even imagine how traumatic that must have been, because it's not just like a death. It's a death of your mother in a horrible, horrible place, and, no wake or no, any type of ceremony or service.
They must have watched her die, slowly. And my mother never talked about it, but it must have been horrible. And my mother actually learned how to sew, and she ended up using that skill to provide for us. A couple of stories, there was...
Well, let me just stop you there and go back to, They get out of this internment camp once the Nazis are defeated and the the armies liberate the Jews.
Right.
What happens to your mother and her two sisters at that particular point in time?
I just want to say one more story about the concentration camp.
Oh, sure.
My mother said that there was a soldier that sort of liked my mother, and he would give her shoes. He would take shoes from somewhere and give him shoes. He could have been killed. And my mother would always make sure his uniform was really well done or something. And he would steal shoes for her, and it was a big deal. Nobody had shoes. And I just remember that story, that there was, a German soldier who really cared about some of these people that were interned.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened was my mother and her two sisters were on the railroad train to Auschwitz to die. When you go to Auschwitz, there's a gas chamber, and
it's a death camp.
It's a death camp. So they were on the road. They were on the railroad train to Auschwitz, and the war ended, and the American soldiers stopped the train. The American soldiers gave everybody 4 choices. You can go to the United States, you can go to Israel, Shanghai, or Argentina. So my mother chose the United States because their father was in Cuba, and they heard that he was back in the United States. He ended up in the United States somehow. So my mother was reunited with her father, and the two sisters were reunited in New York City.
And when you think about, today you send a text, you make a call on your cell phone. In those days, you don't even know where to send a letter. It's not like somebody's picking up the phone and calling you at your residence. I mean, their life was so disrupted that how they were able to reunite with their father is nothing short of a miracle.
Yeah, there were groups, nonprofit organizations that were amazing. I mean, so many people rallied around these young kids and helped them. You got to remember, my mother knew no English. My mother didn't go to high school. She's probably the smartest person I've ever met, but she never went to high school. My mother, there's no question about it, she would have been a doctor, because she loved to hear about it, and she was so bright about it and understood everything, but she never learned it. So I think she would have been a pediatrician.
So they're reunited with their father in Manhattan?
Yes.
And where do they live?
They lived in Upper West Side, some like Inwood area.
Mm-hmm.
All the German Jews congregated there. And there was a social club that they used to always go to. And it was like a dance club. And that's where all their friends would hang out. I know that my grandfather said to my mother, when you come to America, you need to do certain things. You need to get a fur coat. You need to learn English, and you need to learn how to dance. That's what I remember. And so they all went to the social club to learn how to dance. And my mother worked. She worked in the hat industry because she knew how to sew. She learned how to sew in the concentration camp, the work camp. And so she worked in the hat industry. And she knew no English. So my grandfather told my mother and her two sisters they would go to the movies every Sunday, because that's where they learned colloquial English. They went to school for English, but to learn, he always said the best way to learn the language and then become American, because they wanted to be American. They didn't want nothing to do with Germany. So my grandfather made sure that they were American, and they embraced America. So the way you become American is you go to the movies. It was brilliant, I think, because you learn the culture, you learn colloquialisms and things like that.
So where does your mother meet your father?
At the social club.
So your father was German as well?
My father was German. He came over before the war.
Mm-hmm.
So he actually fought in the American army. and then he went to college with the VA, the VA benefits. So he became an accountant, and he went to City University of New York, CUNY, and became an accountant.
And when there's you and you have one sibling.
One sister, 2 years older.
And so your parents who lived in Manhattan relocated at some point to Jamaica.
Right.
And then what is your father doing? What is your mother doing during this time?
Okay, my father was an accountant. He worked for the IRS. So he took the train into the city every day, and he came home late. I really barely knew him, actually. I mean, he was always working. On weekends, he would do tax returns for everybody, and he was actually a fill or brush man. So he would go door to door selling stuff.
Wow, how industrious.
Oh, yeah, we'll talk about that. But
the Germans, you got to love them.
Let's go into this. We had certain things that we held strong. We were told. One was education, and you always had to get a certificate or a degree. My mother always said you got to have a piece of paper, because the government cannot take that piece of paper away from you, because obviously they didn't trust the government.
Mm-hmm.
So never trust the government, but you can be special if you have that piece of paper. And the other thing we were told is we're German. We outwork everybody. We might not be the smartest people in the room, but we'll be the hardest worker. And we never, ever cut corners. We always do the best. And we use it through work, and effort. Another thing I remember growing up is that when we took a train from New York City, from Manhattan to Queens, there was a choice. You can take a bus on Union Turnpike, or you can take the train to the end on Hillside Avenue, and you'd walk about 1.5 miles, 2 miles. So I was a young kid. I didn't want to walk, right? So I said, why can't we just take the bus? So you know what my father said? He says, we are German. We walk. We don't take the train. That's the easy way out. We walk. And then you have to walk a certain way. You have to walk with your chest up and your arms back. And we had to walk quickly because we were German.
We wanted to take a quick break to remind you about our sponsor, findagreatattorney.com. Dealing with the aftermath of an accident or injury can be overwhelming. And the last thing you want to worry about is finding the right lawyer. Findagreatattorney.com simplifies the process by connecting you with one of the top attorneys in your area who specializes in your specific type of case. Whether you've been injured in a car accident, suffered a slip and fall, or experienced medical malpractice, findagreatattorney.com has a network of experienced lawyers ready to help. And remember, their service is completely free, so you can focus on your recovery without worrying about the cost of legal representation. If you or someone you know needs legal assistance, don't hesitate to visit findagreatattorney.com and let them match you with one of the best lawyers in your area for your needs. You know, it's funny you mentioned that. I was an exchange student in high school to Germany, and my ex-wife is German, was born in Germany. And there is a certain mentality with Germans about punctuality, about hard work, about cleanliness. I remember when I was in Germany that every morning when the shopkeepers would open up their shops, the first thing they would do is they would get the broom, they would sweep up everything in front of their shop, they would take out the hose, they would hose the sidewalk down so that everything was immaculate. There was no dirt, there was no, papers, there was nothing on the street after they finished this chore of making it nice. And things with the Germans are, like you said, very, very structured.
Right.
And you never look for the easy way out. In fact, it's almost like they look for the hardest way possible and they do it that way. And the question is, why are we doing this?
Because we're German.
Right.
why should I walk a mile and a half if I can take a bus?
Because we're German.
Right. And that was, instilled in us from the beginning.
So I'm curious as to what stories. I know your aunt was basically the historian as it related to this internment camp, but what stories did you hear from your mom as it related to her experiences within the internment camp?
Never discussed.
So if you asked your mother questions, she wouldn't answer?
We were not to ask those questions.
Because you were German?
We would just, she must have said, we don't talk about it. We don't talk about the past. We only talk about the future. I mean, there's a couple of things that we did that were a little different. We never closed the doors. Our front door was closed because of security, but our bedroom doors were never closed. Our bathroom doors were never closed. We went to the bathroom with the doors open because a closed door is the concentration camp, is the gas chamber. So we never, ever closed doors. And that was a little, And the second thing is all my friends had backpacks. We were not allowed to wear a backpack because the Germans had the guns and the bullets in their backpack. And when the Germans came in with a backpack, they were shooting somebody. So we were never allowed to use a backpack.
And you were the only kid in the neighborhood who played the accordion.
Right. So, so those things, no closed doors, no backpacks. And that was a little different growing up.
And that's amazing how those things tend to stay with you.
Yeah, because when I got married, I never closed the door. And obviously, that was not appropriate. So I had to get used to closing the door. And it was a thing, I got over it. But
So let's talk about your home life and your father's influence and your mother's influence in your home growing up.
Right. So my mother worked at home. She would sew in the basement. So she was always home. And my father was never home. He came home late. Sometimes I would have a second dinner with him. But and when he came home, he was exhausted and he would just lie down. And, he was working basically 2 jobs. And he was exhausted. So on weekends, he was working. So to tell you the truth, I really didn't know my father. The fatherly figure that I had was my neighbor's, my best friend's father was really my father, was my father figure more than my father. My mother was everything. She had the strength. She told us what to do. She was the whole ticket. And she basically raised us.
Well, she raised you. One reason, of course, was at a very young age, something happened to your dad.
Yes. So one day, my father didn't come home. So my mother called the police, and the police said, he's probably shacking up with someone. You can't do a missing thing you have to be missing for 24 hours. So my mother said to the police, you don't know my husband. He was, German. He always followed the rules. And he would never, ever, my mother said to the policeman, he's dead. If he didn't come home, he's dead. And my mother sat us down and said, your father probably died. And he was missing for a week. My mother sent us to school the next day. And life went on when my father was missing. And one morning I woke up and I heard the rabbi in the house. That's when I knew that he died. Why would the rabbi ever come to my house? And so when it turns out, I think he just died of a heart attack, and they stole his wallet. So he was, they finally found him, in the morgue somewhere, and it took about a week to find him.
And how old were you?
12.
So you're 12, your sister's 14, and now your mother is a single parent who is going to raise 2 relatively young children.
Right. And remember, she never went to high school.
Mm-hmm.
She never had any education. She didn't know how to write a check. She worked, So we were in a very, very close-knit community. They were all my friends were German Jewish. And everybody just took over. I remember one of my friend's father was an accountant, and he came and sat my mother down and helped her with the benefits, because my father was in the Army, so there was VA benefits, and then there was other benefits, and then so he took care of all that. He showed her how to write a check. Everybody in the neighborhood just came over and took over.
It takes a village.
Takes a village. At that point, we needed a village.
Mm.
And then my next door neighbor was my best friend of his father. Became my father.
And your next door neighbor was a German Jew?
No, he was Jewish but not German.
So we had talked earlier about the fact that you had a certain mentality as it related to non-Jews.
Yes.
And what was that?
Okay. So remember, we were always taught about never trusting the government. And we were also taught not to trust non-Jews. Now, we're not prejudiced. And you're looking at me like I'm crazy. How could you not be prejudiced? We were just taught not to trust them, but we could be friends with them. And I can give you an example. I was in elementary school or something, and I brought home a black kid to my neighborhood because he was a friend of mine.
A non-German Jew.
Right. Yeah, I had friends that were not Jewish.
Acquaintances.
Right.
And you didn't trust them.
Right. So I brought home. I remember his first name is Ernest. I know his last name, but I'm not going to state it. So he came over and we played. And then the next day, the neighborhood went to my mother and said, "It's not appropriate to have a black person in our neighborhood. This is not a black neighborhood." So my mother basically told them to go to hell. And she said, we're friends with everybody. We don't discriminate. If my son wants to have a friend who's black or Asian, he can have any friend that he goddamn wants to have. So we weren't prejudiced.
Well, I think if you look at the word prejudice, is that you prejudge somebody.
Right.
So if the person is a Christian, you have prejudged them to be of a group that you cannot trust.
Right.
So you were prejudiced. You can justify that prejudice because of what happened to your mother and her experiences. But, and I get the whole reason why this occurred.
Right. But we didn't look bad against them. So a good example is in business. Our accountant was Jewish. Our doctors were all Jewish. Because
your lawyer?
Our lawyer was everybody was Jewish, and everybody was basically not only Jewish but German. Most of them were German Jewish, because that's the neighborhood that's the village.
The butcher?
Definitely German Jewish. Yes. But it's not like we disliked or had hatred towards that. There was no hatred. It was just we didn't trust anybody.
But I think if you take small groups that have been had horrible experiences, that those people similarly situated band together because they're there to protect each other. Right. And I think, it's like if you went on a cruise to the Greek islands, and if you met somebody on that cruise ship from the same town that you grew up in, all of a sudden there would be this immediate bond because you have very similar instances and situations that you can share. So you feel more comfortable with somebody that experienced a lot of the same things you did. And obviously, if you're a Holocaust survivor and you meet somebody else that's a Holocaust survivor, that's something that immediately, like two giant magnets, just pulls you together.
Absolutely.
And I think the worse the experience, the stronger the friendship. So, for example, if, God forbid, you lose a child and you join a support group with other people that have lost children, the people within that support group are very, very tight because they've experienced this horrific event that most people, thank God, do not experience. So it creates a bond. And being a Holocaust survivor is one of those horrific events that creates this very, very strong bond.
Right, but I know that by the law of the word, we were prejudiced, but there was no hatred, and that was the difference. Right now, we were not racists, right? Because we had no hatred towards people. We just didn't trust them. There's a big difference. I think a lot of racists or hate. There's hatred. We had no hatred. We liked them, but we just wouldn't trust them. There's a big difference.
So let's talk about now your journey from the time you were 12, your father dies, and then what happens to you and your sister and your mom moving forward. She's a seamstress and she's supporting the family that way?
Yes, but she obviously revved up her work. She was working, I don't know, she worked 2 jobs, 3 jobs, whatever. Now she started working all the time. So my sister and I, we did the laundry. My mother would teach us how to cook. We cleaned. We did everything. We became, because we're German, right? We don't get it.
Self-sufficient?
Yeah, we basically learned how to run the house. I can tell you a funny story that my mother always reminded me of. She would give us instructions how to cook, right? And once she told me to make the rice. So she said, take like a cup of rice and pour it in the water. I said, that's not enough. I'm when you're a teenage boy, you want to eat a lot. So I just thought that was not enough rice. So I just added more and more rice. You know what happened? It exploded. So I totally destroyed the whole kitchen. There was rice everywhere. So my mother reminded me of that story forever.
That's when you changed career paths. You were going to become a chef, but now you thought, well.
Right. So it took me like all week to clean up all the rice everywhere. But that's when
kind of like the opposite of cooking spinach, where you start with this huge amount of spinach and it goes down to nothing.
Right. So be careful about the rice.
So one of the things you talked about was the fact that education was of a paramount importance in your family's house and to your mother. So what is it that you did with your education?
Right. So I was always good in math and sciences. So what does a math and science German Jewish man become? He becomes a doctor. There was no other. That was it.
The family business.
The family business. Right. Now, remember, I had no mentors. I had no idea what it was like to be a doctor. But I really had no choice. I had a choice, but was the road that I was going to pass.
So when you were in high school, did you come to the realization that you wanted to be a doctor?
No. In college, it started because I guess if senior year of high school, you had to declare what you want to do, and I was pre-med, yeah. So I guess in high school, but I had no idea what it was like to be a doctor. The dedication, the work, all that stuff.
But fortunately for you, it wasn't that hard because you were German.
Right.
I mean, one of the crazy things I find, and to me it's almost like active malpractice, is when the residents have to work, days at a time without any sleep. And if there's some emergency, if you're sleeping in the broom closet, you jump up and you run into the operating room to assist.
Right.
But that's what that process was like for you, was it not?
Yes, and actually it was not a big deal because I was German. I'm serious. We would work sometimes 36 hours in a row. No problem. I actually enjoyed it because we got to follow the patients through the night, and there was no attendings there to do. We got to do what we wanted to do in the middle of the night. I had no problem working that hard.
So as you go through college and medical school, are the bulk of your friends Jews or non-Jews?
I would say Jewish.
And the reason they're Jewish is that you would gravitate to them in part because of the don't trust the non-Jews.
Right. Well, I think
And
also,
the shared experiences, perhaps.
Yeah, and also I think that where do you meet your friends? You meet your friends in the synagogue, right? So obviously the synagogue was Jewish, and then you meet your friends professionally, and a lot of doctors are Jewish, and
lawyers.
And lawyers. So yes, most of not all of them. We had a few non-Jews friends, but majority of my friends were Jewish. Yes.
So that continued through medical school as well.
Yes.
And then, just guessing, what population in the medical school that you went to would have been Jew versus non-Jew?
Okay, I went to medical school in Philadelphia, and actually my medical school was not very Jewish. I ran into anti-Semitism for the first time in my life.
Really?
And some was in my class, because a bunch of classmates were from rural Pennsylvania, and they never saw Jews. So they thought we had horns or we were funny looking.
Oh my God!
So it was awakening of anti-Semitism.
So what did anti-Semitism look like to you?
They would make fun of me that I was Jewish. They would. I mean, I once got into a fight with my classmate because he started calling me like I don't remember, some sort of bad Jewish name, and I was the first time I've ever seen anti-Semitism. I really didn't, I was shocked because my classmates were, there were definitely Jews, but not a majority at all, which was good. It was actually, in retrospect, it was a good experience for me because I needed to enter the real world, and I definitely entered the real world. Yeah.
And I think when you surround yourself with other Jewish people, Jewish friends, Jewish relatives, Jewish coworkers, and professionals, you kind of insulate yourself from those horrific experiences.
Yeah, but also what's great about entering the real world is you sort of gain trust. I mean, this whole thing about not trusting non-Jews is ridiculous. Mm-hmm. And it took me a long time to get over that because, I developed some real bonds with people in my medical school that were not Jewish. As a matter of fact, I just saw my medical school friends recently, and there was really 5 of us that were really, really close. And 2 of us are Jewish and 3 of us were not. And it took me a long, long time to get over that, trusting other people that weren't Jewish. Now I trust you.
Thank you. And you told me, which I'm very proud of, that you now have about 6 non-Jewish friends.
Yes. Not all. No,
acquaintances. But you don't trust half of them.
No, but that I definitely have, got past that. But it took a long time to get over that.
Your experiences, not so much with your mom telling you about her Holocaust experience, but the way in which she raised you, her moral compass. How did that affect you throughout your schooling and throughout your medical career?
We were unemotional, hardworking, outworking everybody, and getting certificates. That's what our pillars. Outwork anybody. We might not be the smartest, but we'll outwork you. That was number 1. Don't trust the government. Get a certificate because they can't take that away from you. My sister became a nutritionist. She got her certificate. We had to get that. My mother always said, you need that piece of paper because that'll make you special. They can't take that piece of paper away from you.
And it's so funny that, especially when we're younger, it's almost like we're stamped or these thoughts are ingrained in our heads that it becomes a part of us. Like, you wouldn't look at a situation and think, what's the easiest way I can take advantage of this situation and get through it? You just think, okay, I have to walk 50,000 steps. Let's get walking. It's not like, well, can I take the bus or can I take the train or can I use a pogo stick? It's that you know what you have to do and you do it because that's who you are.
Right. Right. We never walked away from hard work.
What is it that you learned from this experience, the biggest lessons, and perhaps how did you then take those and use them in raising your own family?
Well, I think obviously education was everything, and it became everything. And also, I always told them they need a certificate. They need, they need that piece of paper. That was really important. And the hard work. You outwork everybody. We were always, we were also told that, friendly. You have to be friends with everybody, friendly to everybody, not friends with everybody. And you have to outwork everybody. That was always, and no, don't get the easy way out, right?
So when my kids were young, I went through a number of these types of life lessons with them. And when they were very, very young, I said to them, listen, you can be anything you want to be in life. You can be any kind of a lawyer or any kind of a doctor. So I gave them the two choices, anything they wanted to do so long as it involved the law or medicine. And the interesting thing is that I have 2 daughters and a son in that order. My oldest daughter is a lawyer. My second daughter has her master's degree, and my son has a college degree but does not have an advanced degree. And he does very, very well in business. He's a consultant. But it's kind of ingrained in their heads from a very young age that, especially nowadays, going to college, in my opinion, is like going to high school years ago. Right. Our parents' generation. If you went to high school and got a high school diploma in our parents' generation, that was kind of like the norm. Now I think if you don't have a college degree, you're at a distinct disadvantage. And it's almost like you have to get an advanced degree at this particular point in time.
Or a certificate, yes.
And then the other thing I taught them was that, one of the keys of life, in my opinion, is there's no such thing as a free lunch, that you have to work for everything that you want to get. And my kids naturally are, they take all this in and they always have something to say. And I said to them, there's no such thing as a free lunch. And my son, who was probably 10 at the time, said, well, actually, if you work at Google, you get free lunch. I said, that's a different situation.
And he didn't become a lawyer? No. He out-talked you. He's a great kid, though.
So thank you. So what is it that you would like to leave people with as it relates to your experiences with your mom and her sisters in their Holocaust experience?
I think that they became fearless, the 2 of them, and one of them never got over it. So the other thing my mother taught me is carpe diem. Every day is important. Fill the day. Go, go, go. Because she was so surprised that she was alive that every day was important. So, and also the work thing, the work ethic, and, the trust, never trust the government. I got over not trusting non-Jews. It took me a long time, but I have some fantastic friends that are not Jewish, and I have total trust. And there was never hatred. It was just non-trust. But I think it's the seize the day and outwork everybody is what we were taught. Yeah, that was pretty much it.
And the other thing that I've noticed, I've done it, our guests here have done it, when we talk about something in our life like you did earlier, you don't think about this before you talk about it, but all of a sudden you start talking about something where you literally get choked up.
Right.
And to talk about it literally brings you to tears. And it's interesting to me that that's somewhere like back in our mind, and then when you start to talk about it and it becomes real because you're talking about it at the current time, that it becomes so emotional.
Right, and I'm not an emotional person at all.
Because you're a German.
I don't think I've ever cried in my life, or maybe when my stepfather died. But yeah, so I'm not an emotional person.
So we'll have to use that as a reel and hopefully get hundreds of thousands of views. But I think this is a wonderful lesson for people in general. And that is, the secrets are really to life are hard work and perseverance, and to realize that every day is a gift. And for someone like your mother, where she was living at a time where every day could have been her last, that to be living in a time where you have the freedoms to do what you want to do when you want to do it is a godsend. And I think this has been very educational, very motivational, and thank you for sharing this information with us.
Thank you for helping me through it.
You're very welcome. And trust me.
Also, I could never watch Schindler's List or all those kind of things. I would start, watching them, and I just left the room.
Understandably so.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Richard.
Thank you.